As many of you are aware, we normally have a moment of meditation immediately following the offertory and right before the sermon, but this morning we are going to alter things just a bit. So we will have our meditation as a part of the sermon just in a little bit. Today, December 31st, and Carlos, can you pull me down just a little bit in this microphone? I'm a little loud right now. Today, December 31st, is the last day of 2017. So that means 2017 is ending on a Sunday. And as many of you may recall, January 1st was also on a Sunday this year. So that means that many of us are ending the year where we began, right here. 2017 was a year that was bookended by our beloved community. And I think that some of us really needed that extra support this year. 2017 was a difficult year for many of us. I know several people who are quite happy to be bidding it farewell later this evening. For many, it was a year filled with tragedy and heartbreak, fear and violence, frustration and despair. But in the midst of a lot of darkness this past year, there did emerge a light of hope, the signaling of a transformation, a seismic cultural shift that few of us could have imagined following the traumatic end of 2016. If we follow the common thread all the way back to the beginning of the year, we see that 2017 started with an army of pink-capped warrior women descending upon our nation's capital in record number, flexing their muscles, rattling the cages, stepping into their own power. That power, the power of women, was reflected also in our entertainment choices throughout the year. The top 3 movies of 2017, according to the domestic box office, were all stories that centered women and celebrated feminism. Coming in at number 3, Wonder Woman, which of course needs no explanation. Number 2, Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Now, without giving away any spoilers to those of you that have not yet seen the film, I will simply say that in my opinion, and in the opinion of several critics, The Last Jedi was the most radically and subversively feminist movie of the year. And then finally, the number 1 movie of 2017 was Disney's live-action reboot of Beauty and the Beast, which of course featured a strong female lead portrayed by noted feminist and activist Emma Watson, who took the role and kept the role of Belle in spite of defying the will of the studio by refusing to wear a corset during filming. So that's right, the giant mouse finally bent its knee to one of its own princesses. And now, finally here at the close of 2017, we are ending the year exactly where we started, with women changing the course of history. Every December, Time magazine selects a person of the year. The criteria is pretty simple. They select a person, group, or idea that, quote, for better or for worse, has done the most to influence the events of the year. And the most influential group of people in 2017, as selected by Time, was the Silence Breakers, aka the women who launched and sustained the Me Too movement. And I believe that Time got it exactly right. The more that I watch, the more that I read, the more I listen, the more I believe that we are in fact witnessing the beginning of a once-in-a-generation revolution that will change history forever by returning to women rightful control over their own bodies and sexuality. Here's a quick history of the Me Too movement for those who may not be familiar. In early October of this year, the New York Times published an article detailing credible accusations of sexual assault and harassment against one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, producer Harvey Weinstein. And among the women who put their complaints on record were actresses Ashley Judd and Rose McGowan. Stories and rumors of Weinstein's sexual misconduct were somewhat legendary in Hollywood for decades. In other words, women had been complaining about him for years, but their voices were ignored. It wasn't until this year, 2017, that everything changed. A few days after the story broke in the Times, actress Alyssa Milano received from a friend via social media a screenshot that contained the words, "Me too." These words in this context were originally part of a campaign to build solidarity among the survivors of sexual assault and harassment. That campaign was started over a decade ago by Black social activist Tarana Burke. Burke used the phrase "Me Too" for this purpose way back in 2006 when hashtags were still just pound symbols. Over a decade later, Alyssa Milano used her platform as a celebrity to amplify Burke's message. On October 15th, Milano tweeted, "If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write 'Me Too' as a reply to this tweet." The next morning, Milano discovered that more than 30,000 people had replied. Within 48 hours, the hashtag #MeToo had been used over 1 million times. And in just 3 days' time, it had been applied to over 12 million posts on Facebook. Within those 3 days, 45% of US-based Facebook users had friends who had posted the words "Me Too." A week after it had blown up in America, hashtag #MeToo, or variations of it, swept through 85 different countries, including India, the Middle East, and Asia. It was wildfire. Courageous women of all ages, of all races and ethnicities, from every social class, coming together as if to say, to paraphrase from this year's most feminist sci-fi movie, "We are the spark that will light the fire, that will burn the patriarchy down." The speed and the scope of this fire shocked many. But wildfires don't just happen overnight. They are the end result of months and years of drought. And this particular feminist revolution was years, decades, and centuries in the making. I personally first glimpsed the drought about 20 years ago. That's when I was pursuing my undergraduate degree in psychology from the University of Kansas. There I was selected to participate in an honors program that required me to do an original research thesis under the supervision of a professor specializing in the field of my research question. I chose to investigate sexually coercive men. The focus of my research was to determine if there were specific psychological markers that could accurately predict the likelihood that a man would sexually coerce a woman under given circumstances. My hope was that the research might someday be used in future educational programs that could help prevent sexually coercive behavior in men. Now, my research project didn't quite find the magic correlations that I was originally looking for. But it did unexpectedly reveal something that somewhat shocked my professor and excited her so much that she wanted me to continue my graduate study under her to further explore it. Using a bit of creative data analysis, our research discovered that approximately 75% of all the men we studied admitted that they believed that under the right circumstances, it was justifiable for a man to commit a sexually coercive act against a woman. Now, that finding may seem rather pedestrian right now at the height of this Me Too movement, but at the time, at least from the perspective of my professor, it was an astounding finding that as late as the year 2000, 3/4 of men freely admitted that sexual coercion was socially acceptable. The depth and breadth of this problem, of this oppression, defy adequate description. We have been enculturated to objectify and thus devalue women, to view them as a means to an end. The ubiquity of this great tragedy oftentimes made it invisible, and so it hid in plain sight for generations. And if this movement ultimately completes its work, our children will one day wonder in astonishment at what took us so long to fix this problem. They will not readily understand how intentionally cruel and exploitative some men were. Our children will not understand how other men could be so unintentionally ignorant. And they will not understand just how much this generation of women in 2017 had to risk and to sacrifice in order to be heard. Wendy Walsh, a psychologist and former guest on Fox News, was one of the first women to share her story of alleged sexual harassment suffered at the hands of Bill O'Reilly. She explained her initial reluctance to report it in this way. I was afraid for my kids. I was afraid of the retaliation. I know what men can do when they're angry. If the great headline of 2017 is Courageous Women, then there must also be a footnote subtitled Angry Men. Because of the courage of women, our world is changing. It is becoming more just and equal. Power imbalances are being leveled, and that means that powerful men are being dethroned. And so they are angry. They are afraid of the personal loss that true equality represents. But in all fairness, it is not just rapists and molesters and serial harassers who are angry or fearful or confused right now. Many men with varying degrees of culpability, including men who have done absolutely nothing wrong. They are struggling right now with how to respond to this moment in history. And many of their concerns have a measure of legitimacy. Concerns that to be accused of sexual misconduct in this current climate will mean automatically being deemed guilty in the court of public opinion. Concerns that all accused transgressors will be viewed and treated exactly the same, even though the severity and frequency of the offenses, along with the number and credibility of the alleged victims, may vary substantially in each case. Concerns that past sexual advances, believed in good faith by men to have been welcomed, might actually have been understood by women to be coercive. Concerns that the line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior toward women has blurred so much that the rules of sexual engagement have changed so rapidly that it's now impossible to know how to act with women anymore. These fears and concerns, well, they all have a measure of validity. Nevertheless, they cannot serve as an excuse to stop a revolution that will significantly balance inequalities and eradicate oppressions that have persisted in our male-dominated culture since the beginning of history. Now, we cannot ignore these concerns. Rather, we must find a way to work through them. But what we cannot do is allow them to sabotage a movement whose time has more than come. We cannot allow male-centered anger, anxiety, or discomfort to stop this work. Our faith calls us to this work. The first principle of Unitarian Universalism is a call to respect the inherent worth and dignity of every person. To fulfill this promise, we must first recognize that we live in a culture that has never afforded full value, worth, and dignity to women. Our society has historically allowed and encouraged men to appropriate unto themselves a share of ownership over every woman's sexuality. And we must recognize this fact and the immeasurable damage it has done if we are to change it. We must listen to and hear the voices of those who have been disempowered and hurt by this system of patriarchy. And that is part of the reason why, when it comes to this topic, I can only say so much. Though I aspire to be worthy of being called a feminist, I must also recognize that whatever I have to say on this topic will always be filtered through my male experience. We need to hear and follow the voices of those who have personally lived under this oppression. And so, I'm going to shut up for just a moment, and I'm going to give our pulpit to our worship associate, Karen Smith-Scott.
As you may have guessed from Phil's comments, I am intimately and unfortunately familiar with the reason for the Me Too movement and how it affects your life. I have something that I would like to share with you, and when I'm finished, I'll strike the singing bowl and usher you into space for meditation. I spent most of my childhood and half of my adult life as a stone. It's an unlikely occupation, but one made necessary to withstand repeated abuses and assaults on my body, and the complete understanding that my objections were of little consequence in the matter. And so, I cultivated a hard, cold, crusty exterior. I chose to be impervious, immovable, silent. It was easier that way. Every day, I would tell myself, I am made of stone. I do not feel. For to feel means I would have to acknowledge the pain and terror of knowing that I am seen not as a person, but as an object. I am made of stone. I do not think. For to think means that I would have to calculate how much I would lose to assert myself. I am made of stone. I do not sleep. For to sleep means I may not see you coming. I am made of stone. I do not move. For if I move, you may notice me. And I am trying so very hard to be invisible. I am made of stone. I do not flinch. For if I flinch, you will know that you have frightened me and tighten your grip. I am made of stone. I do not speak. For if I speak, no one will believe me. I am made of stone. I do not cry. For if I cry, I may never stop.
One of my favorite prophets is Bob Dylan. And one of his most famous songs is "The Times They Are A-Changin'." I think it's wise for us in this time to heed Mr. Dylan's advice in that song, specifically when he warns, "Don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin." We do not yet know how this revolution is going to end. We can't yet fathom what the full and total consequences will be. But we will all have our part to play in determining what our shared future will look like. And as we prepare to close this morning, I'd like to suggest 3 things that I believe our Unitarian Universalist faith compel us to do in these dizzying days. 1, unequivocally support this movement by believing women and promoting just consequences for survivors and transgressors. 2, while fully supporting this movement, nevertheless actively keep in mind that an accusation is not equivalent to guilt and that not all accusations are equal. 3, and this is a point that frankly deserves a lot more attention, so I hope to devote an entire sermon or 2 to this in the future. I believe that our faith, especially because of our heritage of universalism, I believe that our faith compels us to preserve a path of atonement for all transgressors. Now, it should not be a quick and easy path, but there must be some path available for those who choose to atone and wish to return to the good graces of their community. After watching this Me Too phenomenon explode, after seeing how many women have been affected, what percentage of men out there in our general population do you think have wittingly or unwittingly, at some point in their lives, crossed a line of sexual transgression? How many million? We are not yet prepared to handle the flood of men who are going to be called out and who will be looking for an opportunity to be called back in. What do we do with all of them? If there is no path back, most men will never confess any culpability. Why would they, if reprobation is their ultimate fate? They will deny their misdeeds until the very end. And frankly, you need look no further than Washington, D.C. to see this tragedy playing out in real life and real time. As we close this morning, as we close out this year, I think we can safely say that 2017 was the year of women. But I promise you that the rise of women will not be limited to a single calendar year. This is just the beginning. So to all of you, here's to a new year, a new hope, and a new world. Blessed be and Happy New Year.